The champagne glass shattered before anyone understood what had happened. One moment, it was sitting at the edge of the table, catching the amber light from the chandeliers above, and the next, it was in pieces on the floor, crystal scattered across Italian marble, like the remnants of something that could never be put back together. Vanessa Whitmore sat very still. She did not reach for the napkin. She did not press her fingers to her lip, though she could already taste the iron warmth of blood. She simply sat and breathed and looked at the 70 people in that room who were all suddenly finding urgent reasons to study their dinner plates. The snowstorm outside pressed against every window of the Aspen Mountain Lodge, white and indifferent, and the fire in the great stone hearth crackled on as though nothing in the world had changed. Ryan stood at the head of the table with his hand still raised. He hadn't meant to hit her that hard. That was the first thing he would say later, to anyone who asked. He hadn't meant to, but the sound of it had filled the room sharp and flat and final, the kind of sound that leaves a silence afterward that no one knows how to fill. His mother, Margaret Whitmore, sat 3 seats away with her spine perfectly straight and her expression perfectly composed, the way she had trained herself to be composed through 30 years of managing a family name, worth more than the gross domestic product of several small nations. She did not look at Vanessa. She did not look at Ryan. She picked up her wine glass and set it down again without drinking from it, and that was all. Jason laughed. He was Ryan's younger brother, 34 years old, heir to a minor portion of the Whitmore fortune, and the kind of man who had never once in his life been in a room. His laugh was short and sharp, a single exhale through his nose. "Guess she finally forgot her place," he said, just loud enough for the 12 people seated nearest to him to hear. Several of them shifted in their chairs. None of them spoke. Senator Helen Moore, seated 3 chairs to Jason's left, pressed her lips together and looked at the centerpiece arrangement of white orchids on the table. She was here as a guest. She was here as an ally of the Whitmore family, or so she had always believed herself to be. She looked at the white orchids and said nothing. Vanessa touched her lip with one fingertip. She looked at the small red mark that came away on her finger. She was 41 years old, and she had spent 9 years inside this family, learning how to make herself very small in order to survive. And she understood, sitting there in the wreckage of that silence, that she had just arrived at the end of something. She couldn't name what it was yet. She only knew the silence had changed texture, the way a room changes when a window breaks. Something from outside had come in. Her phone, sitting face down beside her butter plate, buzzed once, then buzzed again. Then, a third time, in rapid succession. She turned it over. The screen showed a single message from a number she recognized as her former producer at the network. "Live now. Turn on the TV." And below that, 3 seconds later, "Vanessa. Now." She looked at that message for a long moment. Around her, the dinner party was beginning the careful, practiced work of returning to normal conversations, restarting at adjacent tables, the distant sound of a server refilling water glasses, Margaret murmuring something low and controlled to the woman beside her about the weather forecast for the following morning. Ryan had sat back down. He was cutting his steak. Vanessa stood up from her chair, tucked her phone into the small evening bag she had set on the back of her seat, and walked out of the dining room without a word. Her heels were silent on the marble. Gloria, her oldest friend and the one person in that building who had come for Vanessa and not for the Whitmore name, watched her go, set her own napkin on the table, and followed. Vanessa had not always been the kind of woman who could be slapped into silence. There was a version of her that existed before Ryan, before the Whitmore name, before Aspen and the Lodge and the white orchids and the senator who looked away, a version that had been sharp and fast and entirely her own, a woman who had spent 7 years in Chicago, building a career out of stories that powerful people did not want told. She had been a reporter for the Tribune first, then a segment producer, then an investigative correspondent whose face Chicago had come to recognize the way they recognize the skyline, as simply part of the landscape, a feature of the city that you trusted without needing to question why. She had broken 3 stories that resulted in federal indictments. She had interviewed a sitting governor on live television and made him sweat through his dress shirt. She had stood in front of burning buildings and flooded streets and courtrooms packed with the families of the wrongly convicted and found every time the precise language that made people feel the weight of what they were witnessing. She had met Ryan at a charity fundraiser on the 38th floor of a Michigan Avenue high-rise 11 years ago. He was handsome in the way that men who have never had to work for anything are handsome, effortlessly, carelessly, as though his face had simply been arranged that way, and he had no particular opinion about it. He was 32. He had a business degree from Dartmouth that he had used to take a position in the family investment firm, which mostly meant attending meetings that other people had organized and signing documents that other people had prepared. He was not stupid, but he was soft in ways that he had never been required to examine, and he had spent his entire life inside a family that treated softness in men as a virtue so long as the family name remained undamaged. He had smiled at Vanessa across a table of imported hors d'oeuvres and told her he had followed her reporting for years, and she had believed him because she was used to being seen for what she did. She understood later that what Ryan had wanted was something more complicated than love. He wanted, in the obscure and half-conscious way of men who have always had everything handed to them, to possess something that other men in his world could not. A beautiful woman was expected in his circle. A brilliant woman was occasionally tolerated. But a black woman, an accomplished black woman, who carried herself the way Vanessa carried herself, that was different. That was, in the specific and ugly language of his psychology, a statement. He told himself it was rebellion. He told himself it was love. He told himself both things simultaneously, without examining the contradiction. They were engaged within 18 months. Margaret Whitmore received the news at a Sunday brunch at the family estate outside Denver and said, to no one in particular, and everyone present, Whitmores don't marry women like her. She said it quietly. She said it the way. She said everything as though she were simply noting a fact of the physical world, like the temperature outside or the distance between 2 points on a map. Then she had picked up her fork and continued eating, and that had been the end of the conversation, though it was not the end of anything else. The first year of their marriage, Vanessa was still working. She had taken a position as a senior correspondent at a network affiliate in Denver, a step down from Chicago, but a step that she had calculated carefully, weighing it against the life she was building with Ryan, the house she was beginning to love, the possibility of something lasting. The Whitmore family events, and there were many, quarterly reunions, charity galas, holiday gatherings that lasted 3 or 4 days, were something she attended, the way a foreign diplomat attends state functions, with perfect composure, meticulous courtesy, and an awareness at all times that she was operating inside a culture that had not been built to accommodate her. She shook the right hands. She laughed at the right moments. She wore her hair straightened for the first 2 years, a decision she made consciously and hated consciously, and never spoke about to anyone except Gloria. The microaggressions began so early and accumulated so gradually that she sometimes had to remind herself they were happening at all. Margaret had arranged the seating at the first Whitmore Christmas dinner so that Vanessa was placed at the far end of the family table, near the younger children and a distant cousin who spent the meal talking exclusively about his boat. It was a round table that seated 16, and there was no arrangement of 16 people around a round table in which one seat was naturally, geometrically further from the center than all others, and yet Vanessa's seat was. She had noted it the way she noted everything, with the observational precision that had made her a good journalist, quietly, accurately, and without allowing the observation to alter her expression. At the family portrait session that spring, a formal affair, a professional photographer, 2 hours on the lawn of the Denver estate, Vanessa had been positioned at the edge of the group in the first arrangement, and then, in the second arrangement, had somehow drifted out of the frame entirely, standing just beyond the boundary of the photograph while the official Whitmore family portrait was taken without her. Ryan had not noticed. She had not said anything. She had stood on the grass with her champagne glass and watched the photographer pack up his equipment and felt something close in her chest, like a door swinging shut. She had driven home that afternoon, thinking about what her mother had said the year before the wedding, the one cautionary conversation Diane had offered and then never repeated. Some rooms are built to exclude you, and the question is not whether you can change the architecture, but whether the room is worth the effort of trying. The year after that, at a dinner party at the home of one of Ryan's business partners, a woman named Sylvia had introduced Vanessa to her husband as Ryan's urban phase, laughing immediately afterward as though it were a joke, which it was not. At the Whitmore spring luncheon of the following year, she had been standing near the buffet when a server, a young man who was clearly new, had approached her and asked if she could point him toward the kitchen, having assumed from the way she was standing near the serving table, and, presumably, from looking at her, that she was part of the catering staff. She had pointed him toward the kitchen. She had done it with a steady hand and a steady voice, and then gone to find a bathroom where she could be alone for 4 minutes. Gloria had been at that luncheon. Gloria had seen the whole thing happen from across the room, and later, driving home, she had taken Vanessa's hand and held it without speaking for nearly 20 miles, which was exactly the right thing to do. The comments about her hair began sometime in the 3rd year. Vanessa had started wearing her hair natural. She had made that decision on a Tuesday morning, standing in front of her bathroom mirror, and it had felt like the most important decision she had made in years, small and enormous at once. Margaret had looked at her hair at the next family gathering the way one looks at a piece of furniture that has been rearranged without permission, with a slight tightening around the eyes that communicated displeasure more clearly than any words could have. Jason had been less subtle. Very ethnic, he had said, that first time, tilting his head slightly, performing an appraisal. Very Harlem Renaissance. He had laughed at his own observation. Ryan, standing 3 feet away, had said nothing. He had changed the subject, which Vanessa recognized over time as his primary defense mechanism. The subject was always changed. The moment was always redirected. The discomfort was always managed in the direction that cost him the least. 9 years. 9 years of changed subjects and redirected moments. 9 years of standing at the edge of photographs and being introduced as an afterthought. 9 years of watching Ryan's mother move through rooms like a woman who had decided, at some point long before Vanessa arrived, exactly what the Whitmore family was and what it would remain. And through all of it, Vanessa had kept her dignity the way you keep a flame in wind cupped in both hands, leaning over it, feeding it the minimum it needed to survive. She had kept it because she was not the kind of woman who let other people's smallness make her small. She had kept it because she had grown up watching her mother do the same thing in the same kind of rooms, and she understood that there is a specific and ancient kind of strength in surviving the things that were designed to break you. The Whitmore Winter Reunion was held every year at the lodge in Aspen, 3 days of meals and meetings and social performances that served the dual purpose of maintaining family bonds and conducting the kind of informal business that wealthy people conduct when the conversation is not being recorded. This year, 70 guests had been invited, including 2 sitting senators, a federal judge, 4 significant investors in the Whitmore Family Fund, and a collection of the social satellites that orbit families like the Whitmore's people who are invited because their presence confirms the host's position in the hierarchy of the world. The lodge was magnificent in the way that only very expensive things can be. Crystal chandeliers casting amber light across walls of reclaimed wood, a fire in the great stone hearth that burned all day and all night because there was always someone to tend it, the kind of quiet that comes from deep snow on a mountain, and money thick enough to insulate against every kind of weather. Margaret had given a speech at the dinner on the second evening. It was a speech about legacy, about the Whitmore name, and what it had built, and what it would continue to build. She had spoken about bloodlines, and continuity, and the responsibility of families to protect what they had created. And every word of it was technically about the family business, the generations of capital and connection and careful management that had produced the lodge and the chandeliers and the 70 people sitting around the table. But Vanessa had heard the other speech underneath it, the one running parallel to the words being spoken, the one that was about belonging and not belonging, about who was inside the frame and who had always been positioned just beyond it. She had sat, with her hands folded in her lap, and listened to both speeches simultaneously, and said nothing, because she had learned to be still in these rooms, the way prey learns to be still. Jason had started early in the evening, before the dinner was even fully underway. A comment about the wine being a little too dark for his taste that was aimed at Vanessa's direction with the precision of someone who had spent years practicing the art of saying something that could not quite be challenged. Then a remark, when the conversation turned to a new television program, that certain networks were lowering their standards to appeal to certain demographics. He had been doing this for 9 years, and he had gotten very good at it, this method of inflicting small wounds while remaining technically innocent of any specific crime. Each individual remark was deniable. The pattern was undeniable. Ryan, seated beside Vanessa, had cut his lamb and said nothing. It was the silence, in the end, that was the final unbearable thing. Not Jason's cruelty, which was at least honest in its way. Not Margaret's polished contempt, which had never pretended to be anything other than what it was. It was Ryan's silence, the ongoing, continuous, practiced silence of a man who had chosen, every single time he had been given the choice, to protect himself rather than his wife. Vanessa had understood for a long time that she was in a marriage that had been built on sand, but she had not understood, until that evening, that the sand had run out entirely. She had waited until Margaret finished her speech. She had waited through the applause, light and polished, the sound of the upper class congratulating itself for existing. And then she had stood up from her chair, not dramatically, not with the explosive energy of someone who has finally broken, but with the deliberate and careful motion of a woman who has made a decision and is going to honor it, and she had spoken. She spoke about 9 years. She spoke about family portraits and wine comments and the word urban and the bathroom at the spring luncheon. She spoke without raising her voice, which was somehow worse than shouting would have been, because it allowed every person at the table to hear every word with perfect clarity. She spoke about what silence does to a person over 9 years, not the silence of the people around her, but the silence she had maintained herself, the silence that had felt like dignity, and had... Jason had laughed halfway through. "There she goes, playing victim again," he said, in the voice of a man who has used the word victim as a weapon so many times it has become his first language. Several people shifted in their chairs. Several people looked at their plates. Margaret sat with her perfect posture and her perfect expression and waited for the disruption to resolve itself, the way she always waited for things to resolve themselves. Vanessa looked at Ryan. She had turned to face him directly. The table was absolutely still. Even Jason had gone quiet. Ryan's face did something complicated. There was embarrassment in it, and there was anger, and underneath both of those things, there was the specific and corrosive shame of a man who knows he is being seen accurately and cannot bear the seeing. He was not, at his core, a good man, but he was not, at his core, a cruel one either. He was something more ordinary, and in some ways more damaging than either. He was a weak man who had spent his entire life being protected from the consequences of his weakness, and in that moment, sitting in front of 70 people with his wife looking at him in a way that stripped everything away, the weakness and the shame and the years of insecurity about his career versus her career, and his reputation versus her reputation, and his life versus the life he had imagined collided into something that became a raised hand. The sound of it silenced everything. And then the glass broke. The snow was still falling when Vanessa walked out. She didn't take her coat from the cloakroom. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She walked through the entrance hall of the lodge with Gloria, 3 steps behind her, through the heavy wooden door, and out into the cold. The valet attendant moved toward them immediately, reading something in their faces that told him not to ask questions, and brought the car around in under 2 minutes. They sat in the back seat together in the dark, the heater running, the mountains invisible around them in the storm, and Gloria held Vanessa's hand, the way she had held it on that drive home, 20 miles after the spring luncheon, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Vanessa's phone began to ring. Not a buzz, a full ring, from a contact she recognized. Then another. Then 3 texts in rapid sequence from numbers she recognized as network people, journalists, industry contacts she had maintained through the years she had spent pulling back from her career, letting it idle, while she managed the impossible geometry of being a Whitmore wife. She opened the most recent text first. It was from her former producer, direct and unembellished. They were airing it right now. She needed to see it. Now. Gloria reached across and turned on the small screen mounted in the back of the car. The network logo appeared, and then a news desk, and then the network's chief programming executive standing in front of a backdrop she recognized immediately as the network's main studio in New York, and he was talking about a new era in American broadcasting, about excellence and representation, and the future of the network's identity. And then the screen behind him filled with her face, her reporting, a highlight reel of 7 years of work that she had done before she had ever heard the name Whitmore. The war dispatches from Eastern Europe. The investigation into the county housing authority that had displaced 11,000 families. The interview with the governor, that the governor's press secretary had tried to stop and failed to stop because she had already been in the room with a camera crew, and the governor had been too proud to walk out. The awards. The profile in a national magazine with the headline that her friends still teased her about. And then the executive was saying her name, her full name, Vanessa Day Whitmore, and announcing that she would be joining the network as its first black female primetime anchor, effective immediately, beginning with the Monday evening broadcast. She watched the screen. She watched her own face, younger and sharper and completely unafraid, moving through the reel of her own history. She felt the blood drying on her lip. She felt the cold in the car, despite the running heater. And she felt something else, something that had no single name, that was composed of grief and relief and rage, and something so close to joy that she didn't dare call it that yet. A sensation of having been underwater for a very long time, and finally, breaking the surface. Well, Gloria said softly, there it is. Back inside the lodge, the evening was attempting to recover. Servers moved with practiced discretion, refilling glasses, replacing the shattered flute with a fresh one, quietly collecting the pieces of crystal from the marble floor. The conversations had resumed at most tables, though they were quieter now, more careful, the way conversations are when everyone in the room has witnessed something they would prefer not to have witnessed. Ryan sat at his place and ate his dinner. He ate it mechanically, cutting and lifting and chewing without tasting, because his body had learned long ago how to perform the motions of normalcy, regardless of what was happening underneath. Jason had poured himself more wine and was talking to the man on his right about a ski run he planned to attempt in the morning. Margaret was speaking quietly to Senator Moore, something about the proposed tax structure for family trusts, a topic she returned to reliably when she needed to feel the solid ground of power beneath her feet. It was one of the junior members of the catering staff who turned on the television, a young woman, barely 16, who had taken the job for the season through a local placement agency, and who had been standing near the kitchen corridor when the slap happened, close enough to see everything, close enough to see Vanessa's face in the moment after, and who had, without fully deciding to do it, pointed her phone at the table and recorded 37 seconds of footage before the sound of the glass breaking had startled her into lowering it. She had not yet decided what to do with the footage, but she had heard the news announcement filtering through from the back kitchen, where someone had been watching the broadcast on a tablet, and she had felt something she couldn't have articulated, except as a sense that the two things, the 37 seconds on her phone and the announcement on the screen belonged together, needed to be together, were in some essential way the same story. She walked into the dining room with a remote control and turned on the large screen mounted above the fireplace, the one used for presentations and family videos at these reunions, and the network broadcast filled the room. It took perhaps 6 seconds for the room to understand what it was looking at. 6 seconds of ambient conversation continuing, of forks moving toward mouths, of Senator Moore making a point about quarterly projections, and then, one by one, like lights switching off along a street, the voices went quiet. Because the face on the screen was the face of the woman who had just walked out of this room with blood on her lip. And the voice from the screen was saying her name, her accomplishments, her history, the scope of what she was and what she had built before she had come into this family's orbit and been systematically diminished within it. Senator Helen Moore, who had said nothing when it happened, stood up from her chair. She stood up very slowly, the way people stand up when they understand that a moment has arrived that will require them to be more than they have been. She looked at Ryan. She looked at Jason. She looked at Margaret, who was sitting with her wine glass raised halfway to her lips, and her expression, for the first time in the memory of anyone in that room, entirely unguarded. That, Senator Moore said, in a voice that carried the full length of the table, is the woman your son just assaulted. She set her napkin on the table. She picked up her bag from the back of her chair. She walked out of the room, and the sound of her footsteps on the marble was the loudest sound in the building. The panic moved through the room in waves. Ryan pushed back from the table. He said something, 2 or 3 sentences of something that was meant to explain, to contextualize, to frame the incident in a way that made it something other than what it was, but no one was listening with the particular quality of listening that produces belief. The investors exchanged glances. The federal judge set his utensils down with precision and reached for his phone. Jason stopped talking about ski runs. Margaret Whitmore, who had navigated every crisis of the past 30 years with a composure that had become the defining characteristic of her public identity, sat very still with her wineglass still raised, and said nothing, and nothing, and nothing, for what felt like a very long time. 3 police officers arrived at the lodge 40 minutes later. The roads in the storm were slow, but the call had come from Senator Moore's personal phone, and there are some calls that move faster than others. The drive up the mountain had taken them through 12 miles of whiteout conditions, the kind of storm that made the world shrink to the radius of your headlights, and yet all 3 of them had made the drive without urgency in their voices when they arrived, because urgency would have been the wrong tool for this room, and they understood, in the professional and deeply experienced way of people who have walked into difficult rooms for a living, exactly what kind of room this was. The Whitmore family attorney, who was also a guest at the reunion. This was the kind of family that kept its attorney present. At family gatherings, met them at the door, and attempted to manage the situation in the way he managed all Whitmore situations, with careful language and the implicit suggestion that there were better ways to resolve things than official procedures. The officers listened to him with the polite attentiveness of people who have heard this kind of speech before and are not moved by it. Jason stepped forward when the officers entered the dining room. He positioned himself between them and Ryan in the specific way of a man who believes that his physical presence in a space is itself a form of authority. He told the officers that this was a private family matter. He used the word misunderstanding 4 times in under 2 minutes. He mentioned his brother's name and his family's name with the particular inflection that is meant to remind the listener that there are consequences to their actions in this room, consequences that flow in the direction of the person invoking the family name. One of the officers, a woman named Carter, who had been on the force for 11 years and had heard every variation of this speech, looked at Jason with an expression of complete professional neutrality and told him to step aside. Ryan's gaslit version of events began immediately and collapsed almost as immediately. He had not meant to. It was a gesture. Her reaction had been exaggerated. The glass was already falling. She had provoked the confrontation. The stories arrived in quick succession, each one slightly different from the last, in the way of stories that have not been prepared in advance. Several guests were asked if they had witnessed the incident. Several guests said they had not been paying attention. Several guests found reasons to step away from the table, to check their phones in the corridor, to visit the restroom for an extended period. The girl from the catering staff walked forward. She was 16 years old, and she was terrified in the way that honest people are terrified when they are about to do the right thing in a room full of people who don't want them to. She held out her phone to Officer Carter without saying anything. Carter watched the footage. 37 seconds. Very clear. The angle was slightly elevated, from near the kitchen entrance, and it captured not just the slap itself, but the 7 or 8 seconds before it. Vanessa's voice, Ryan's face, the trajectory of his arm, and the 12 seconds after, when Vanessa sat with blood on her lip and 68 people found reasons to look elsewhere. Carter watched it twice. Then she looked at Ryan. "Sir," she said, "I need you to stand up." He stood up beside the fireplace, and the family portraits, a century of Whitmore faces in gilded frames, 2 senators and a governor, and several other men who had built things with money and called the building a legacy. And he stood there in the amber light while Officer Carter placed her hand on his arm and told him his rights in a voice that was steady and unhurried and did not raise itself for anyone in the room. Jason said his brother's name in a tone that had never failed before to produce the right effect, and it produced nothing. Margaret said, "This is deeply unnecessary," and it produced nothing. The federal judge looked at his phone. The investors looked at each other. The room was absolutely still, except for the fire in the hearth, which burned, on the way it always burned, indifferent and constant, and entirely unconcerned with who was in the room. "You had everything," Officer Carter said quietly, almost to herself, as she guided Ryan toward the door. Her partner corrected her gently. It wasn't her place to editorialize. She nodded. She said nothing further, but the words hung in the room after she said them, the way certain true things hang in a room, not dissolving, just settling, sinking into the floor and the walls and the faces of the people who heard them, the way snow settles onto a mountain and waits. The footage was everywhere by morning. The network's broadcast had aired on a Friday evening, and by Saturday, the two stories had merged into a single story: the announcement of the anchor position and the 37 seconds of kitchen corridor footage, and the story had moved with the particular velocity of things that people feel they have been waiting to be angry about. The hashtag appeared within 6 hours and was trending nationally within 12. Legal analysts appeared on competing networks to discuss the footage's implications. Social commentators appeared to provide historical and cultural context for what the images represented. Former colleagues of Vanessa's appeared and spoke about her work, her character, her journalism, the things that the Whitmore marriage had largely eclipsed in the public memory. And the picture that emerged was so much larger and more significant than the specific incident in the Aspen Lodge that it became something else entirely, a national conversation rather than a personal tragedy, though it was also, underneath all of it, still a personal tragedy. Ryan's legal team filed a motion to suppress the footage on the grounds that it had been recorded without his consent. The motion was denied. Ryan's family issued a public statement that was carefully worded to express concern for both parties without assigning fault to either, which produced a backlash that was in some ways more damaging than the footage itself, because it confirmed for the watching public what the footage had implied, that this was a family that managed harm rather than confronted it. Several of the Whitmore Fund's investment partners issued statements of their own, noting that they were reviewing their relationships with the fund in light of recent events. Two of them did not issue statements, but simply declined to renew their contracts when they came up for review 6 weeks later. Margaret Whitmore gave no public interviews. She retreated to the Denver estate and did not emerge for 3 months. The trial was brief. Vanessa's testimony took 45 minutes, and she delivered it in the voice she had used for 7 years on camera: clear, precise, human without being sentimental, factual without being cold. She described the incident. She described the 9 years preceding it. She described the footage accurately and completely, correcting the defense's characterizations without anger, with the methodical patience of a woman who has spent her career in rooms where powerful people told incomplete versions of the truth and has learned exactly how to dismantle those versions without raising her voice. Ryan's testimony was less disciplined. He contradicted himself on 3 occasions. He made references to Vanessa's career trajectory in a manner that his own attorney visibly winced at, because the references made it apparent to anyone paying attention that his central grievance was not the argument itself, but the fact of her success, the way it had grown, while his had not, the way it had become undeniable, while his had remained dependent on his family name, the way she had continued to be more than he was in every room they had shared together. The verdict was guilty. The sentence included mandatory counseling, a period of incarceration, and a permanent restraining order. Ryan's face, when the verdict was read, was the face of a man who had expected, despite everything, to be protected from consequences. It had always worked before. He had always, in all the rooms he had ever occupied, been protected by something: by his name, by his family, by his money, by the social contract that had been written long before him and that had reliably produced outcomes in his favor. He had grown up in a world where the name Whitmore was a kind of key that opened certain doors and quietly closed others, and he had never once been required to question the mechanism, because the mechanism had never failed him. He sat in the courtroom and waited for the protection to arrive, and it did not arrive, and what was left on his face when the waiting was over was something that looked less like a man and more like an outline of a man, the shape of someone from whom everything reliable had been removed. Jason was not present for the verdict. He had left the courtroom at the lunch recess on the second day and had not returned, and no one had gone to find him. The Whitmore family's losses were more diffuse but no less real. 3 investment partners, 2 board resignations, a profile in a national business publication that was technically neutral and read as devastating. The charity gala they had hosted annually for 17 years was quietly discontinued when the venue declined to renew the contract without explanation. Margaret was seen twice in Denver in the months that followed, both times alone, walking with the careful, measured pace of a woman who has become aware that she is being watched. The family name did not disappear. Names like the Whitmores do not disappear. But it was damaged in the way that certain things are damaged, not broken, not destroyed, but fundamentally altered, so that it could never again be picked up and used in quite the same way. 6 months after the reunion in Aspen, Vanessa sat at the anchor desk of the network's primetime broadcast for the 93rd consecutive evening. The ratings had climbed steadily from her first broadcast and had not stopped climbing, partly because she was an exceptional journalist, and partly because there was a portion of the viewing public that had been waiting for a long time to see this particular face in this particular position, and was now watching every evening with the quality of attention you give to something you have been denied and finally received. The studio was arranged the way television studios are arranged. Lights and cameras and a team of people just beyond the frame of the visible, a small, controlled world built to produce the impression of something larger, and she was at the center of it, which was where she had always belonged. She had started the foundation 4 months earlier, with Gloria's help and the help of 2 lawyers she had known for years and trusted completely. It was called the Day Foundation, her mother's maiden name, the name her mother had kept through 2 marriages and a career of her own that had been brilliant in ways that had never been properly recognized, and the name that Vanessa had carried as a middle name through all of it. The foundation's work was straightforward: legal support for women experiencing domestic abuse, with a specific focus on women whose cases involved elements of race and class that complicated the existing support structures. Gloria ran the day-to-day operations from an office in Chicago, in a building 6 blocks from the Tribune where Vanessa had started her career, and she ran them with the same steady intelligence she had applied to everything in her life, without drama, without self-congratulation, with the deep and unfussy competence of someone who understands that the work is the point and the attention is beside the point. She called Vanessa every Wednesday morning with an operations update that was precise and complete, and always contained at least one story from the helpline. Not the worst ones, because the worst ones were not hers to share, but the ones where something had shifted, where a woman had taken a step, where the foundation had been the thing that made the step possible. Those Wednesday calls were the calls Vanessa cleared her schedule for, without question. The website had launched to 40,000 visitors in the first week. The legal helpline had received more calls in the first month than they had projected for the first year. 3 retired judges had agreed to serve on the advisory board. The work was very large, and there was no end to it, and most evenings, after the broadcast, Vanessa sat in her dressing room for 20 minutes, with the door closed, and breathed, just breathed, before she went home. Her mother, Diane, called every evening after the broadcast. She was 71, and she lived in the house in Hyde Park, where Vanessa had grown up, a 2-story brick house with a garden that had overgrown slightly since Diane's knee replacement, but that was otherwise exactly as it had always been. Books on every surface, a kitchen that smelled of something in a pot on the stove, the specific quality of light through the south-facing windows in the late afternoon that Vanessa could close her eyes and see without effort. Diane had worked for 33 years as a high school English teacher in the Chicago public school system, and she had taught the same books year after year, the ones about dignity and suffering and what people owe each other when they share the same world. And she had believed in those books with a fidelity that had never required her to pretend that the world they described and the world she lived in were the same world. She had raised Vanessa inside that understanding, that you could love language and truth and human possibility, even while knowing exactly how frequently the world failed all three. It was perhaps the most important thing she had given her daughter, more important than the name, more important than the books, more important than the 2 years of community college tuition she had scrimped to provide when Vanessa's scholarship had fallen short. Diane watched the broadcast every evening on the television in the living room, the same television she had watched for 30 years, and every evening after the closing credits, she called her daughter, and they talked for somewhere between 12 and 30 minutes about the broadcast, and about other things, and sometimes about nothing in particular: the garden, the weather in Chicago, a book Diane was reading, the neighbor's new dog. Vanessa had her mother's voice memorized in the way that children memorize certain things, without meaning to the rhythm of it, the specific warmth of it, the particular way Diane said her name that had always made her feel like herself. On the evening of the 93rd broadcast, Vanessa sat in the anchor chair and looked at the camera and felt, as she looked, the specific texture of the moment, not the studio around her, which she had grown accustomed to, but the larger moment, the one that had started in a mountain lodge with a sound like a door slamming shut, and had moved through grief and trial and public scrutiny and legal process, and arrived here, at a desk in a studio, with a camera in front of her and a country watching. She thought about the family photograph on the lawn of the Denver estate, the one that had been taken without her, the frame that had been carefully composed to exclude her. She thought about standing on the grass with her champagne glass, watching the photographer pack up his equipment. She thought about the specific and particular loneliness of that moment, the way it had felt like a statement about who she was and who she would be permitted to remain. She was at the center of the frame now. She was the frame, not because anyone had placed her there as a symbol, or a statement, or a response to anything that had been done to her, but because she had always been this, had always been exactly this. And the only thing that had changed was that the frame had finally been made wide enough to include her. The broadcast began. She read the introduction to the lead story in a voice that was steady and clear and entirely her own, the voice she had trained for 20 years and protected through 9 difficult ones. And 70 million people heard it from their living rooms and their kitchens and their phones and their tablets. And some of them recognized in it something they had needed to hear for a long time, not the specific words, which were about a policy debate in the state legislature, but the voice itself, what it carried beneath the words, what it said by simply existing in that chair at that hour on that screen. Between segments, there was a moment, 10 seconds, maybe 12, when the camera cut away and the studio was briefly, quietly still. Vanessa sat in that stillness. She felt the lights above her and the weight of the microphone on her lapel, and the cool, managed air of the studio and the distance between herself and every room she had ever stood in, where someone had tried to tell her, through exclusion or dismissal or cruelty or silence, what she was and was not permitted to be. She thought about what she would say when the camera came back to her. She thought about the women who called the foundation helpline at 2 in the morning and 3 in the morning, women who were sitting in the specific darkness of lives that had been organized around silencing them, women who were just beginning to understand that the silence they had maintained was not dignity, or not only dignity, but also a form of protection for the people who were harming them. The camera returned to her. The red light blinked on. She looked into it the way she had always looked into cameras directly, without flinching, as though the lens were a person she was trying to reach. The teleprompter scrolled the text for the next segments close. She read it as written, because the broadcast was the broadcast, and it had its own structure, and she honored that structure every evening. And then the segment ended, and there was a transition, and in the space of that transition, 4 seconds that belonged entirely to her, she looked into the camera and spoke the words that were not on the teleprompter, the words she had been carrying for a long time, since before Aspen, and before Ryan, and before the 9 years, and before the family photograph, and since always, really, since she was a young woman who had chosen this work, because she understood instinctively that silence was not neutral, that silence, in the presence of cruelty, was itself a form of speech, and that what it said was, "I permit this. Silence protects cruelty," she said. Her voice was very quiet and very clear, and I refuse to be silent anymore. The light blinked off. The broadcast moved to commercial. In a living room in Hyde Park, Diane set down her cup of tea and looked at the television screen, and felt something that she had no name for and did not need to name, something composed of all the years, and all the rooms, and all the careful, costly silences, and everything that had been built in spite of them. She sat in the particular light of the south-facing windows, the light that her daughter could close her eyes and see, and she waited for the phone to ring.